Today, all that almost all paid off, and guess what? A thriving industry providing jobs all across this country. So, Madam President, we have a lot to be proud of and a lot to look forward to. We just got to keep on the path, take a little risk once in a while, push the envelope, and bank on the American people. Madam President, I yield the floor. I note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Mr. President,
Majority Leader.
I ask consent to call the quorum be terminated.
Without objection.
I now ask unanimous consent that all post-cloture time be yielded back and the motion to proceed be agreed to. That's what I am doing. That the committee report amendments be agreed to. The bill as amended be considered original text for the purpose of further amendment. Further, that it be in order for Senators Boxer or designee on behalf of Senators Johnson and Shelby, the chairman and ranking member of the Bank Committee, to call amendment number 1515, which is at the desk. That following the reporting of the amendment, the Senate proceed to a period of morning business. Senators permitted to speak for up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection.
Under the previous order, Mr. President, all post-cloture time is yielded back and the motion to proceed is agreed to. Clerk is going to report. Is that right now?
Under the previous order, all post-closure time is yielded back and the motion to proceed is agreed to. The clerk will report the bill.
Calendar number 311, S1813, a bill to reauthorize federal aid highway and highway safety construction programs and for other purposes.
I'll read that too. In the previous order, the committee reported amendments are agreed to and the bill, as amended, will be considered original text for purposes of further amendments.
On behalf of Senators Johnson and Shelby, the chairman and ranking members of the Bank Committee, I send an amendment to the desk.
Clerk will report.
Senator from Nevada, Mr. Reed, for Mr. Johnson and Mr. Shelby, proposes an amendment numbered 1515. At the end, add the following. Division D, Public
As for the reading, the
Transportation.
amendment be dispensed with, Mr. President.
Without objection, under the previous order, the Senate will proceed to a period of morning business with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each.
Mr. President.
Senator from Missouri.
President, I ask unanimous consent that it be in order at this time to offer amendment number 1550 to the underlying bill, Senate Bill 1813.
Is there objection?
Mr. President, I of course reserve the right to object and do object.
Objection is heard.
Mr. President.
Republican leader.
Mr. President, our country is unique in the world because it was established on the basis of an idea that we are all endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights, in other words, rights that are conferred not by a king or a president or a Congress, but by the Creator himself. The state protects these rights, but it doesn't grant them. And what the state doesn't grant, the state can't take away. That's what this week's debate on a particularly odious outcome from the President's health care law has been about. Our founders believed so strongly that the government should neither establish a religion nor prevent its free exercise that they listed it as the very first item in the Bill of Rights. And Republicans are trying today to reaffirm that basic right. But apparently our friends on the other side don't want to have this amendment or debate. They won't allow those of us who were sworn to uphold the U.S. Constitution to even offer an amendment that says we believe in our First Amendment right to religious freedom. Frankly, this is a day I was not inclined to think I would ever see. I've spent a lot of time in my life defending the First Amendment, but I never thought I'd see the day when the elected representatives of the people of this country would be blocked by a majority party in Congress to even express their support for it, regardless of the ultimate outcome. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Majority Leader.
I appreciate the comments of my distinguished Republican colleague. The Senate just voted 85-11 to invoke cloture on a motion to proceed to the Surface Transportation Bill, a bipartisan bill, sponsors of which Senator Boxer, Senator Inhofe, an unlikely pair, but they joined together to move forward on a piece of legislation that is extremely important to this country, a bill that will save or create 2 million jobs. There are 4 parts to this bill within the jurisdiction of 4 Senate committees. Environment and Public Works Committee, that's what we're on now, and I've sought to amend that by the provision that's coming from the Banking Committee. We have one from the Finance Committee that's been approved on a bipartisan basis, and we'll move, after we do those 2, to the Commerce section. We've not had the first, we have not dealt with the Finance Committee provision or the Commerce Committee. Now, Mr. President, I appreciate the Republicans' opportunity to never lose an opportunity to mess up a good piece of legislation. We've seen that happen now for the last 3 years. We saw it in spades last year. Here is a bipartisan bill to create and save jobs. No one disputes the importance of this legislation. Every state in the union is desperate for these dollars. We're not borrowing money to do it, it's all paid for. Whether it's the state of West Virginia, the state of Missouri, or the state of Nevada, all the departments of transportation there are waiting to find out what's going to happen at the end of this month, February. That is fast approaching. We need to get this done. Then I hope, Mr. President, we can deal with other matters and not get bogged down on this legislation. Let's do the banking part of this bill. Let's do the finance part of this bill. Let's do the commerce part of this bill. But to show how the Republicans never lose an opportunity to mess up a good piece of legislation, listen to this. They're talking about First Amendment rights and the Constitution, and I appreciate that. But, Mr. President, that is so senseless. This debate that's going on dealing with this issue dealing with contraception is a rule that hasn't been made final yet. There's no final rule. Let's wait till there's at least a rule that we can talk about. There is not a final rule. That's what all that you read about in the newspapers, why there's discussions going on as we speak. There's not a rule. Everybody should calm down. Let's see what transpires. So let's deal, until there's a final rule on this, let's deal with the issue before us. That's saving jobs for our country. And people can come and talk about the Constitution and the First Amendment, and I've never seen anything like this before, but I've never seen anything like this before either. There's no final rule. Why don't we just calm down and see what the final rule is?
Senator from Missouri.
Mr. President, of course, I'm disappointed not to be able to offer this amendment today, but it's an amendment that we've been talking about for some time. This is a bipartisan amendment. It was a bipartisan piece of legislation. Senator Nelson from Nebraska and I would like to offer it, and we'd like to offer it as soon as possible. I have the highest regard for both of our leaders, both the majority leader and the minority leader, and understand they have a job to do, but this highway bill is going to clearly take some time. This is a 4-page amendment that I'd be glad to see voted on Monday. It's been widely discussed all week this week. I would have been glad to see it voted on when I filed the bill in August. There wasn't a rule then either, but both Mr. Nelson and I, Senator Rubio, Senator Ayotte, and others were anticipating that we were going to begin to see exactly the kinds of things that this discussion this week has brought about. This is about the First Amendment. It's about religious beliefs. It's not about any one issue. In fact, this amendment specifically does not mention a specific issue. It refers to the issue of conscience. And in the amendment itself, the reference is made to the letter that in 1809 Thomas Jefferson sent to the New London Methodist, where he says of all the principles in the Constitution, the one that we perhaps should hold most dear, if I could paraphrase it a little bit, is the right of conscience, and that no government should be able to come in and impose itself between the people and their faith-based principles. And in health care, we've never had this before. Why didn't we need this amendment, or why didn't we need the bill that was filed in August 5 years ago, or 1 year ago, or 2 years ago, or 3 years ago? Because only with the passage of the Affordable Health Care Act did we have the government in a position for the first time ever to begin to give specific mandates to health care providers. And this bill would just simply say that those health care providers don't have to follow that mandate if it violates their faith principles. And it's whether it's faith principles that are part of a health care delivery system that could be through any number of different faith groups, and I've talked to a lot of them. And frankly, some of those faith group views of health care don't agree with my faith, with my views or my faith views of health care, but that's not the point here. This is not about whether I agree with what that faith group wants to do, but it's whether they're allowed to do it or not, whether the representative of that view of health care and how it affects people is able to say to their government, no, this is something that's protected by the Constitution. It's protected by the First Amendment. You can't require me to provide a service through a faith-based institution that I don't agree with. Or you can't require me as a health care provider to provide a service that I don't agree with because of my faith. Doesn't mean you can't get it somewhere else if it's something that can legally be done. It just means that people of faith or institutions of faith don't have to do it. That's why in almost every Catholic church in America the last 2 weekends, a letter's been read from the bishop or the archbishop that said this is unacceptable, it should not be complied with. That's why the chaplain to the Army, the chief archbishop to the Army, Archbishop Broglio, sent out a letter to be read at Catholic Mass on Army posts all over the country, and initially that letter wasn't going to be read because it didn't agree with apparently the tenets that the government was pursuing at a time, which is the violation that people would see most offensive, I think, that the government would actually begin to say, a people of faith, you can't even talk about. You can't even have that letter read on a military post from the person who's responsible for the chaplains, the Catholic chaplains in the military. Or maybe it's a faith view of how to deliver health care that somebody in the Christian Science community has, or somebody in the Seventh-day Adventist community has, or the Southern Baptist community, or whatever that might be. The specific thing is not the issue here. The issue here is, can government require a faith-based institution to go beyond the tenets of its faith? And I know the leader, the Democrat leader, the majority leader said that, well, there's not even a rule yet. Well, the White House said the administration said there'd be a rule, and to make it even more offensive, they said, and by the way, here's what the rule is going to be, and we're going to give you a year to figure out how to adjust your views to accommodate the rule. I would have been less offended if they just said, here's the rule. And we understand that it's in violation of your rules, but your views, but here's going to be the rule, and you're going to have to comply with it. The idea that you could change your rules in a year, or your religious views, rather, your religious beliefs in a year or a lifetime, because some federal regulator says you need to, is unbelievably offensive in our country, based on the principles that we hold most dear in the Constitution itself. And so this amendment, which is bipartisan in nature, I think easily understood because it is so fundamental to who we are, is an amendment that could be quickly debated, it could be quickly voted on, the Senate of the United States could express its view, and I believe that view would be one supportive of institutions of faith. And by the way, also, Mr. President, the administration saying, well, we gave an exemption for the church itself. Now, one, I don't know how long that exemption would last, and two, I think that shows a lack of understanding of the work of the church, or the work of the synagogue, or the work of the mosque, or the work of people of faith coming together. If the only thing that matters in their work is what happens within the four walls of the church, or whoever works in the four walls of the church every day, these institutions are not what I believe they are. You know, the great schools, the great hospitals, the great community providing institutions of America have so many of them for so long have been based on faith principles, and this amendment would say for health care, those faith principles would still be the overriding principle. For health care, if someone doesn't agree with the direction of the government, they don't have to perform that service. They don't have to provide that specific kind of insurance to their employees. And remember, the underlying bill here, the underlying rule here that has been announced, even though it may not have been officially issued, is one that talks about people who have chosen to go to work for, to get a paycheck for, to work at the direction of a faith-based community, and then to tell that community what your insurance has to look like. Well, that's just one of many steps. If the government can do that, what can't the government do? If the government can do that, where does the government stop? If the government can do that, when you say, well, you know, this is something I don't believe in, so I don't want to be part of this particular health care issue, this health care moment, this health care episode, whatever you'd want to call it, you say, oh, well, you've got to do it because the government says you have to do it, and the First Amendment doesn't matter. The protection of conscience doesn't matter. The Jefferson letter to New London Methodist doesn't matter. And until the enactment of the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, this was never an issue. And nothing would happen if this amendment was approved and became the law of the land. Nothing would be different tomorrow than it was a year ago. Because a year ago, people weren't doing this. And 5 years ago, nobody would have thought it was even possible that the federal government would tell a faith-based hospital what their insurance plan exactly had to look like, that they offered their employees, or would tell faith-based health care providers what they could do and what they couldn't do. Or would say, if you're not going to do everything the government will pay for, we won't pay you to do anything the government pays for. So, Mr. President, this is an issue that many people in the country feel strongly about. Many people in the Senate, both Democrats and Republicans, feel strongly about. We can let this go on and create the anxiety it creates for the faith community, or we can bring this amendment up, debate it, and frankly, I think it's pretty well understood. Debate it, vote on it, and let the country know that we still support the Constitution of the United States. And while I'm disappointed I didn't get to offer this amendment today, Mr. President, I will be back, and we will do I'm going to do my best to get this amendment offered at the earliest possible time, and I'd be glad to see the Senate join me and the majority join me in saying, let's get this important issue off the minds of the American people and let them know that the Constitution still matters and religious liberty is still the First Amendment to the Constitution in the United States of America. And I yield back.
Mr. President.
Senator from Wyoming.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise today to speak about a bill I'm introducing today, the United States Job Creation and International Tax Reform Act of 2012. The name says it all. This is a bill that would incentivize American companies to create jobs in the United States, while at the same time leveling the playing field for U.S. companies in the global marketplace. This bill would reform and modernize the rules for taxing the global operations of American companies and would help America become a more attractive location to base a business that serves customers all over the world. Unfortunately, our current tax rules do just the opposite. In fact, many businesses could be better off if they were headquartered outside the United States. That's not right, and Congress should fix it. This bill would do just that. I want to thank Senator Hatch and members of his staff who have been helpful in working through the complexities of this international tax. I also want to mention Eric Ullman, a member of my staff, and a CPA who worked with me in developing this legislation. He has lived overseas and worked with the U.S. tax laws overseas. That's the kind of expertise we need to reform international tax law. Now, I want to thank all who testified before the Finance Committee, especially Scott Natchez, who's the Vice President and General Tax Counsel of Cargill, this man has dealt with the complex accounting of foreign earnings and the money to be repatriated to the United States, an actual practitioner who we've relied on. He gave us insight into the years of records that have to be reviewed for a single item in the complex web of the current international tax system in order to bring the money back to the United States. And finally, I want to thank Dave Camp, the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, who kick-started the discussion on tax reform when he released his discussion draft last October. Now, enacted in the 1960s, our current international tax rules have passed their expiration date. Many of the United States' major trading partners, including Canada, Japan, the United Kingdom, and most of Europe, have moved to what are called territorial tax systems. That's actually a word for a global tax system. These types of tax systems tax the income generated within their borders and exempt foreign earnings from tax. The United States, on the other hand, taxes the worldwide income of U.S. companies and provides deferral of the U.S. tax until the foreign earnings are brought home. Deferral of the tax until the earnings are brought home encourages them not to bring the money home. It actually incentivizes them to leave their money abroad and to expand over there. Because the U.S. has nearly the highest corporate tax rate in the world, companies don't bring those earnings back and instead reinvest, as I said, outside the United States. That's certainly not a recipe for U.S. growth and U.S. job creation. The dominance of U.S. headquartered companies in the global marketplace is waning. 36% of the Fortune Global 500 companies were headquartered in the United States in 2000. In 2009, that number dropped to 28%. That's from 36% to 28% among the Fortune Global 500 companies headquartered in the United States. Clearly, America is losing ground, and our current international tax rules are a big part of the problem. The bill I'm introducing today would help to right the ship by pulling our international tax rules into the 21st century so that U.S. companies are not at a competitive disadvantage with foreign companies because of American tax rules that are outdated by changes most other countries have already made. The bill would give U.S. companies incentives to create jobs in the United States and undertake activities in the United States in order to win globally. So first, if the foreign earnings have already been subject to a tax in a foreign country, this bill would provide a 95% exemption from the U.S. tax on those foreign earnings. This would allow for American-managed capital to be put to the most productive use and help stabilize our economy. Second, this bill would allow foreign earnings that are currently sitting overseas to be brought back to America at a reduced rate, not a zero tax rate, but a greatly reduced rate, and with the ability to pay the taxes that are owed in installments. That gets the cash back now and still gets some taxation for us, instead of leaving it all overseas. This provision would serve as a transition to the new territorial system by allowing U.S. companies to unlock a significant amount of capital currently being held offshore and quickly move into the new territorial system. And that means more jobs and a better economy. And it also emphasizes one of the things I talk about with any of the tax changes, as one of the few accountants, you got to transition into these things if you want to make the companies be stable enough that they can exist through the change in the tax codes, and that provides for a transition as well. Third, this bill would reduce the U.S. tax burden on income generated by American companies from ideas and innovations. This bill would encourage companies to develop and keep rights to ideas and inventions in the United States. When families tune in to 60 Minutes on Sunday evenings, they'd hear fewer stories about how U.S. companies are moving their profits to tax haven countries and avoiding U.S. tax on those earnings. Families would hear fewer stories about how the U.S. multinational companies set up post office boxes in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland without a single employee or officer of the company anywhere in sight, and attribute a significant portion of their foreign earnings to those jurisdictions. Instead, families would hear more stories of how U.S. companies are generating the ideas and inventions of tomorrow right here in America. This bill can be a first step in tax reform. We have a lot of work to do in many other areas of tax law in order to make it simpler, fairer, and more transparent. We need to be looking at the individual tax system, the corporate tax system, and particularly how we tax the pass-through entities like partnerships and S-corporations, who have to pay the tax on the money when it's still invested in the business. I also recognize that as we move forward in these other areas, it may be appropriate to make changes to this bill. This is exactly how the legislative process should work, and I look forward to getting back to conducting the Senate's business in regular order, where we work through the issues first in committee and offer amendments to improve the bills that ultimately come to the Senate floor, where there's a shot for everybody else to make amendments. But today, with the introduction of this bill, we move from discussion to action with respect to a single piece of the tax reform. The Simpson-Bowles Deficit Commission recommended a move to a territorial system, and I'm glad to be moving the conversation forward on this recommendation with the introduction of this bill today. I hope this bill will begin a discussion of fairness that needs to begin yesterday. I hope that members and their staff will review the bill and the detailed explanation that we've prepared. I also ask that all interested stakeholders review the bill and reach out to my staff and the staff of the Finance Committee to discuss what they like, what they don't like, and their suggestions for improvements. That's the way bills are supposed to work. The international tax rules are not easy. They're not simple, and reforming them will be a heavy lift. But those things are worth doing, and when they're worth doing, they're rarely easy or simple. I look forward to joining with my colleagues to pass international tax reforms that our American companies and our country desperately need. And I would ask unanimous consent that the bill be included in the record following these remarks.
Without objection,
Mr. President, I yield the floor.
the senator's bill will be received and appropriately referred.
Mr. President,
Senator from Iowa.
A week ago, we passed a very important good government bill, the one that would make sure that members of Congress can't benefit from insider trading information. I added to that an amendment that I think is a good government amendment. It calls for people that are involved in political intelligence gathering, and that's a profession. You don't hear much about that profession, but it's quite a business. Asks that they be registered just like lobbyists are registered. And I'd like to speak to the point of why that's very important and why it's important to bring it to the Senate's attention, even though it passed by a vote of 60 to 39 just a few days ago. Because in the dark of night, Tuesday of this week, the House released its version of the insider trading bill that goes by the acronym STOCK, S-T-O-C-K, which wiped out any chance of meaningful transparency for the political intelligence industry. Now, just think about the chutzpah of people in the House of Representatives, a small group of people taking out the language that I put in that bill when like language is co-sponsored by 288 members of the House of Representatives. But it happened. So that bill's coming back here without the Grassley amendment on it. And we need to think about what we're going to do if you believe in good government, if you believe that there ought to be more transparency in government. What we're faced here with is a powerful industry that works in the shadows, economic espionage. They don't want people to know what they do or who they work for. They are basically afraid of sunlight, I would guess. My amendment was adopted here in the Senate on a very bipartisan basis, kind of a rare occurrence today. It simply requires registration for lobbyists who seek information from Congress in order to trade on that information. So, isn't it very straightforward? If trades are taking place based upon political intelligence, that's their word, economic espionage, my word, obtained from Congress or the executive branch, people in this country should know who is gathering such information. Not requiring political intelligence professionals to register and disclose their contacts with government officials is a very gaping loophole that my amendment fixes. In fact, political intelligence firms actually brag about this loophole. And I'll give you, for example, about that bragging. This is on the website of an organization called the Open Sources Intelligence Group, a political intelligence firm. Quote, our political intelligence operation differs from standard lobbying in that the Open Source Intelligence Group is not looking to influence legislation on behalf of clients, but rather provide unique monitoring of information through our personal relationships between lawmakers, staffers, and lobbyists. Providing this service for clients who do not want their interest in an issue publicly known is an activity that does not need to be reported under the Lobbying Disclosure Act, thus providing an additional layer of confidentiality for our clients. This service, the organization continues, is ideal for companies seeking competitive advantage by allowing a client's interest to remain confidential. Think about the words personal relationships, confidentiality. Do all this under the radar is basically what they're saying. So I want to go back. If you didn't hear it the first time, let me repeat some of this for you, a very much shorter quote. Providing this service for clients who do not want their interest in an issue publicly known is an activity that does not need to be reported under the Lobby Disclosure Act, thus providing an additional layer of confidentiality for our clients. Now, you have it here on paper, and I just read it to you. This firm, probably one of many firms, but I don't know how many firms are doing this, is telling potential clients, if you don't want anybody to know what you're asking of federal officials, hire us. And that's just wrong. But that's why firms like this don't want to register. If someone on Wall Street is trying to make money off of conversations that they have with senators or staff, we should know who they are. It's just that plain and simple. Since the passage of my amendment, which would require political intelligence lobbyists to register as lobbyists, I have heard a great deal of quote-unquote concern from the lobbying community. Political intelligence professionals have claimed that they should do their business in secret for several reasons. Now, this is the explanation of why you need secrecy. First, they've said that if they are required to register, they will no longer be able to sell information to their clients because people will not want to hire them. That makes me wonder, what do they have to hide? Second, they have said that many of them have large numbers of clients, and it would take them a lot of time to register these large numbers of secret clients. Again, that makes me think that we actually need more transparency to find out who all these people buying intelligence information are. Thirdly, they have claimed that it would not address the so-called 20% loophole that allows people who spend less than 20% of their time lobbying from having to register under existing laws as lobbyists. Not too many people know of that 20% loophole, but that's a pretty big loophole. You can lobby but not register if you don't spend more than 20% of your time on it. Well, on this issue, I have some good news for these people. We don't make the mistake that caused the 20% loophole. My amendment requires anyone who makes a political intelligence contact to have to register. No loopholes, no deals, no special treatment. Just everyone registers. Finally, I just want to assure people, particularly journalists, that you won't have to register. Now that information's been floating around. Or it's been floating around that some constituent looking for information in order to make a business decision might have to register. Not so. Only political intelligence brokers, people who seek information so that others can trade securities, would have to register. As I said before, if people want to trade stocks from what we do here in Congress, we should know who they are. After all, the basic underlying piece of legislation prohibits members of Congress from having insider trading information and profiting from it. We ought to know who we're dealing with. The American people deserve a little sunshine from this industry and on this industry. Last night, the House turned away from transparency. They supported the status quo. Mr. President, what we need is a full and open conference, a process that will go so we can take this very important issue up once again, that the House feels was somehow not very important, even though 288 members of the House of Representatives, that's two-thirds of the House of Representatives, have signed on to this principle that these people ought to register. And we can take that up then in Congress, both the House and Senate, working together. Now, is every word in this bill the way it ought to be? If somebody wants to point out some things that ought to be changed, I'm open to that. But don't forget, 288 people in the House have signed on. It can't be too bad. So, if we don't get to conference, or if we have to debate this again on the floor of the Senate, we might not get 60 votes again. So I would worry that we will miss the best opportunity that we have had for openness and transparency in years. I yield the floor. I would like.
Senator from Oregon.
Mr. President, when we went to college, usually things were different. Often a student took out a loan, but those loans were manageable, and usually there were jobs waiting. Today, too often, that's not the case. In fact, the students today who take out loans will leave school sacked on average with $25,000 worth of debt. And they're going to be trying to get into a labor market where there are more than 4 unemployed Americans for every available job. Mr. President, it has been noted that for the first time, student loan debt exceeds credit card debt, and that now totals over $1 billion. Now, clearly, investment in higher education today is an economic imperative. Education is the great equalizer. It enables upward economic mobility, and it breaks down class structures that impair many countries' ability to grow their economies. A highly skilled and educated workforce is the basis for a healthy economy, and it is the linchpin to our economic future. Now, in every major economic decision our people make, they try to evaluate, Mr. President, the value of that decision, like prospective homeowners who inspect and assess the potential value of their future home. In my view, future students should be able to comparison shop and choose a school and a program based on what their return on investment will be. Now, our capital markets work best when we can accurately measure the value of the things we choose to invest in. We saw what happens when that's not the case, when the housing bubble burst and our economy is still struggling to recover from the mortgage meltdown. In many instances, consumers who didn't have all the facts bought a product based on misleading information and often fell victim to predatory lenders looking to make a profit off that growing bubble. Consumers must know what they can expect from their investments, and students are entitled to know the value of their education before they go out and borrow tens of thousands of dollars from the banks and from the government to finance their choices. Right now, Mr. President, consumers don't have this information, though the information exists. It's unavailable to students and families too often when they're making perhaps the most important decisions that affect their future, both their financial future and their career. That is why today, Mr. President, I am introducing the Student Right to Know Before You Go Act, which would help college students, prospective young people, get the information they need about their education. This proposal would ensure that future students and their families can make well-informed decisions by having access to information on their expected average annual earnings after graduation, rates of remedial enrollment, credit accumulation and graduation, the average cost both before and after financial aid of the program, and average debt upon graduation, and finally the effects of remedial education and financial aid on credential attainment and a greater understanding of what student success can mean. Mr. President, for markets to work, there has to be good information available. And until now, it has been extremely hard for students and families to collect this data in a cost-effective way while at the same time ensuring student privacy. However, the states, as we have seen so often, the President of the Senate and I have talked about this from time to time, the states have piloted their own programs and proved that technology exists to enable our ability to generate and share this information in a way that students and consumers can use while at the same time protecting their privacy. This technology, in my view, makes it possible to ensure a return on their investment for students, for parents, for policymakers and taxpayers. And it's going to help us create a workforce that meets the demands of the business that employ it and ensures that our workers can successfully compete in the global economy. One last point, if I might, Mr. President. I think it is clear that access to higher education is an integral part of the stepladder to success, and particularly success for the middle class that built this country. Chairman Harkin, of course, the chairman of our committee that deals with these issues, has probably done more than any other member here in the United States Senate to put a focus on this issue, how important it is to grow the middle class, address the big concerns that they have faced. Middle-class people haven't had a pay raise in a full decade. And it seems to me, as part of the agenda, and Chairman Harkin has had some excellent hearings on these higher education issues, one of the best ways that we can come together on a bipartisan basis is to empower students and empower families to be in the best possible position to make the college choices for them that are going to pay off in the years ahead. That's what this legislation, the right to know before you go act, would do. I hope my colleagues will consider it in the days ahead. Mr. President, with that, I yield the floor. And I would note the absence of well, here's my colleague. I'd ask to withdraw my request for court.
Mr. President.
Senator from Minnesota.
Mr. President, I'm on the floor today to discuss something that has been a top priority for me in the Senate, and that is the critical need to get serious about building a new energy agenda for America, one that keeps our businesses competitive in the global economy, preserves the integrity of our environment, and restarts the engine that has always kept our country moving forward. That is innovation. And I'm specifically focused on the energy tax extenders, those that are so necessary for us to keep going in the area of homegrown and renewable energy. We all know that there is no solution, single solution for getting us here. What we do need is not a silver bullet. We need a silver buckshot, as we like to say in Minnesota. With many of my colleagues, I've talked about the need to continue developing alternative resources such as hydro, geothermal, biofuels, solar, wind, and we've also talked about how we need to continue developing existing technologies like domestic oil and gas production while enforcing appropriate safeguards. This is the very all-of-the-above approach that we need to take in order to keep all options on the table. This means exploring some of the new proposals we've seen with promising technologies like the smart grid. But it also means extending the critical tax incentives that have been so important in advancing the development of the next generation of biofuels and the next generation of renewable energy. That's why I've pushed to ensure that we have the right policies in place for encouraging clean energy innovation, including the biodiesel tax credit, which supports over 31,000 jobs and has allowed domestic production to more than double since 2011. It means the production tax credit, which has made it possible for wind power to represent over a third of all new electricity generation capacity in the United States last year. Think of that figure. Think of the strides that we've made and where we can go in the future. And the Advanced Energy Manufacturing Tax Credit, which has leveraged $5.4 billion in private investment, boosting growth and creating new U.S. manufacturing jobs by producing components and equipment for the burgeoning global renewable energy industry. Extending these critical tax credits will help strengthen our country's clean energy business so that they can continue to grow and thrive. But they are just one part of the equation. Again, there is no silver bullet solution to our nation's energy challenges, and that is why we need to be willing to come together to hammer out a comprehensive strategy for moving forward. We cannot afford to keep our heads buried in the sand. We cannot afford to let yet another golden opportunity pass us by. Too many have already sadly come and gone. Over the years, I believe there have been, especially in this last decade, several moments when we could have acted but didn't, when we had the full support of the American people who wanted a new direction in energy policy. The first was immediately after 9/11, when I believe President Bush, if he had made a new energy policy one of the challenges to the country, in addition to invading Afghanistan, combating terrorism, I believe we could have moved forward. But that didn't happen, and there's no need to dwell on it today. The second movement was before you, Mr. President, was in the Congress, and that was the summer of 2008, when we did take action to raise gas mileage and energy efficiency standards, something I like to call building a fridge to the next century, but we didn't make that kind of comprehensive progress on a comprehensive energy plan that we should have made. The third moment was when President Obama first came into office. I, at that time, advocated for a clean energy standard that could have, I believe, passed in the first 6 months, could have been combined with some of the other comprehensive things we're talking about. We had a bipartisan group going at the time, a group of 14 of us, but instead a decision was made to focus on cap and trade later instead of starting with that clean energy standard and building from that. Well, those were missed opportunities, a chain of missed opportunities. But until we get serious about building a new energy agenda for America, we're going to continue to struggle with the consequences which have created a vicious cycle of economic and environmental costs, not least of all those caused by climate change. Climate change, as you know, isn't just about melting glaciers and rising ocean levels. Shifting global trends have the potential to wreak intense havoc on local economies, particularly those anchored in agriculture. The facts stand for themselves. In January 2010, the United States Securities and Exchange Commission said for the first time that public companies should add climate change to the list of public financial or legal impacts that they actually disclose to investors. The Bureau of Economic Analysis at the Department of Commerce estimates that at least 1/3 of the U.S. gross domestic product is weather and climate sensitive, with a potential economic impact of $4 trillion a year. Much of that impact would be wrung out of our farm communities and from states with large rural populations like my own. Any farmer will tell you that a change in weather can mean the difference between a bumper crop and a complete disaster, regardless of how hard that farmer works. So it goes without saying that any kind of significant swing in climate paired with increasingly unpredictable rainfall could pose a problem to Americans who make their living off the land. In 2008, our country's farms, forests, and ranches produced $18 billion in goods and exported close to 1/3 of that. This is a sector that is critically important to our economy, and we can't afford for it to be jeopardized. We also can't afford the rising costs of fire management, as forest fires have become increasingly intense in recent years. The current path is not sustainable, and that's why I'm on the floor today, in the hope that we can spark a meaningful conversation, but most specifically, that we look at extending those energy tax credits. I believe we can take a page from our state, the state of Minnesota. My home state is proof that policies promoting homegrown energy can also promote business growth and job creation. The unemployment rate in the state of Minnesota is 5.7%, well below the national average, and part of that is thanks to our energy policies. In fact, a recent report by the Pew Charitable Trust showed that in the last decade, Minnesota jobs in this sector grew by 11.9%, compared to 1.9% for jobs overall. As I travel around the state, you can see the progress that has been made. I think of places I visited like Sabika, Minnesota, small town, where a small telephone company felt that their customers who were in extreme rural areas needed backup power supplies. So what did? They found a way to combine wind turbines and solar panels so that they could actually purchase, their customers could purchase backup power. They did it themselves, and they sold it to their customers. Well, it was very popular, and at one point an 80-year-old man came to see them, and he said, you know, I'd like to purchase more. I want to do my whole house in solar. And the telephone company said, sir, you know, you can do that, but it'll take you about 10 years to get your investment out, but it's going to be worth it, but it takes 10 years. But do you mind if we ask how old you are? And the man said, yeah, I'm 85 years old, but I want to go green. Those are true stories from the state of Minnesota. Then there's Pentair, a Minneapolis-based water solutions company that has donated a custom-designed rainwater recycling system to the new and great Target baseball field. That technology will capture, conserve, and reuse rainwater, saving the ballpark more than 2 million gallons of water each year. And in one of General Mills' manufacturing plants, they've developed their own innovative way to reuse water, diverting it to the local municipal golf course to water the grass. These are just a few examples of Minnesota's commitment to energy innovation. There are countless stories out there, but it isn't just a Minnesota story, it's an American story. And I would note that the renewable energy standard in Minnesota, 25 by 25, one of the most aggressive in the country, 30% for Excel, and yet our unemployment rate is so much better than the rest of the country. The quest to develop clean, sustainable, homegrown energy isn't specific to one part of the country, or for that matter, for one political party. Our renewable energy standard was actually nearly unanimously adopted by the legislature, Democrats and Republicans, and signed into law by Republican Governor Pawlenty. This is an issue that I believe we can and should unite us, and it's a way to address these concerns because it builds a coalition across a broad spectrum, and that is energy policy. It saves you money, it's better for the environment, and it is certainly better for our national security if we're producing our own homegrown energy. In the past, Democrats and Republicans have managed to come together to confront tough challenges, from the Civil Rights Act in the 1960s to keeping Social Security solvent in the 80s to welfare reform in the 90s. But perhaps the most fitting example in the context of combating climate change is the Clean Air Act. As you know, that landmark bill took the first steps to address acid rain and expanded efforts to control toxic air pollutants. When the bill passed in the 1990s, it had strong bipartisan support from Democrats and Republicans alike. It's worth mentioning that all 10 members of the Minnesota delegation at the time, which included 5 Democrats and 5 Republicans, that's our federal delegation, supported the bill, including Republican Senator Dave Durenberger, who is among its chief authors and staunchest supporters. Since then, the Clean Air Act has helped prevent more than 18 million child respiratory illnesses and 300,000 premature deaths. Policies to protect our rivers, lakes, and streams have also had a positive impact on people's health. Coming from the land of 10,000 lakes, I have a unique appreciation for the importance of clean water. It is the resource that sustains our lakes and rivers, that provides critical habitat to countless fish and millions of migratory birds, that fuels our thriving outdoor economy. Hunting and fishing are more than just hobbies in our state, as you know, Mr. President. They're a way of life, and they are critically important to our economy. Every year, nearly 2 million people fish our lakes and our streams, and close to 700,000 people hunt our fields and forests. Nationwide, the hunting and fishing industry is valued at $95.5 billion a year,